Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here on Zoom. I'm Cindy Olsavsky. I am our Cradle Liberty Council Alumni and Friends Officer, and we are excited to bring you this Facebook Live discussion tonight with the one and only Dr. Bruce Terry. You already know that Bruce is quite the mountain climber, and last year he summited Mount Everest. What you might not know is that Bruce is an endodontist. He's served in various leadership roles in state dental associations. He's a teacher, has received journalism awards for his writing, and is part of a not-for-profit that provides over 2,000 patients with dental care each year. Bruce is a NESA National Outstanding Eagle Scout and has been active Scout leader since his son Henry joined the Cub Scouts in 2008. He has been an assistant Scoutmaster and a Scoutmaster with Troop 181 right here in Gladwin, Pennsylvania. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to Dr. Bruce Terry.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy. I appreciate it. I'd like to, Greg, if you, oh, we got it. I'm okay, thank you. All right. I want to thank Cradle of Liberty for allowing me to speak tonight. I think at first it's interesting to see all the people that are on, and I hope I can entertain you for the next hour. Oh, I forgot I was wearing this. So, you know, the new norm around here is wearing a face mask, but honestly, that's what you do when you're in the Himalaya on a regular basis, because the dust and debris from yak dung and other things floating in the air give lots of respiratory problems. So when I started having to wear a mask last month, it really wasn't that much different for me. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, and about my journey, and about what isolation is like, and how you have been coping with, and how you might be coping with it in the coming weeks. So anybody that's on here that I have to give a shout out from Troop 181, I'm happy that you're joining this presentation tonight, and anybody else that knows me through other avenues or vehicles, thank you for being on tonight. So a little bit about me. I am an Eagle Scout, as Cindy had mentioned. I started my scouting career in California, Los Angeles specifically, where I grew up. Where for me, summertime was probably the greatest time of year, because I had the opportunity to get to Emerald Bay Scout Camp on Catalina Island. And once you got a taste of that, you stayed in Scouts as long as you could, because that was definitely the coolest place in the world to go. So, you'll see the banner that I'm holding here on the Summit of Everest was on May 23rd of 2019, so we're getting close to that date. As of right now, I was doing my one of my last rotations up to Camp 3 to prepare myself for the summit bid, and so that same banner that I'm holding on the summit is now behind me as a prop for today. I started my backpacking career as a tenderfoot scout, and that led me through lots of adventures. Sadly, I didn't get to Philmont as a child, but I got there as an adult with my son in 2016. But beginning around the early 2000s, I had an opportunity to get out to Seattle and climb Mount Rainier. And I really fell in love with that adventure. It led me to start asking about other mountains around the world, and led me to understand what's called the Seven Summits Club, which is summiting the highest peak on each continent. And you'll see on this slide that is up now, it'll show you the dates at which I climbed these different peaks. So Kilimanjaro came after in 2007. That was followed by Elbrus, and then Denali, or by Elbrus in Russia, and then Aconcagua in Argentina, and then Denali or Mount McKinley in North America, in Alaska, and then the Carstensz Pyramid, in Papua, Indonesia, Vincent in Antarctica, and then finally Everest in Asia. And so those were the peaks that I climbed in order to become one of fewer than 500 or so individuals that have ever recorded having climbed all 7 summits. So that's a pretty small club. These are the additional peaks that I climbed to practice and to get accustomed to traveling on ice and glaciers and rock and everything else. So it takes that kind of weekend backpacking trip that the scouts and the scout leaders are familiar with, and it takes it to a whole new level. And that's what I found exciting. This is not the same as what you've seen with big wall climbing, the things that you've seen done with free solo and other stuff like that. That's not what I do. You'll see pictures of what I do. But I've been around the world. This was my first of the 7 summits. That's the top of Kilimanjaro. At 19,000 feet, it's pretty interesting for never having been to that altitude before. But then when you go to base camp of Everest, you're at 18,000 feet for more than 6 weeks. So here I went to 19,000 feet and I'm huffing and puffing. And when I went to Everest, I spent more than 6 weeks at 18,000 feet. So it's amazing the difference from one mountain to another. This is me approaching the summit of Aconcagua. That was the peak that I climbed in 2012. We had a group of people from all over the world, and most of these adventures are filled with climbers from all over the world, which is another interesting part of the whole adventure, being able to find and meet people with similar interests, being able to share stories of where I've been and where they've been, just create an excitement for each of us to want to go to other places. So when I've been on some of these climbs, previous to being able to climb the future peaks that I would eventually climb, I had the opportunity to talk to people that had climbed Denali or had climbed Carstensz Pyramid. And it was quite an interesting time to sit in the evenings or during a break and be able to enjoy the stories that I could pass on to climbers that would go to where I've been and vice versa. This is us approaching Elbrus. Elbrus is in southern Russia. It's in the northern Caucasus. And this picture was taken by a team that was descending that early morning as we were trying to climb. We had a group, and here you can see it's absolutely a cloudless sky. But about 3 hours later, we were in a deep snow and almost non-visible conditions. This is me fooling around on a little peak near the top of Denali, not quite on the summit, but nearby Denali. And it can just show you that a guy that has a slight fear of heights can still do some kind of crazy things. And yes, you did hear that right. I do have a slight fear of heights, but I was able to make that work. This is me looking at the mouth of Cotopaxi in Ecuador. That's at about 19,000 feet. Greg, I don't know why there looks like there's some doodling going on. I'm not quite sure what that's all about, but just giving you information. I climbed in Ecuador a couple of times. There were peaks there, Cayambe and Cotopaxi, and they are beautiful peaks to climb. They're simpler to climb than some of these other 7 summits peaks, and a lot of fun. And you could get down there, and in less than 8 days, you can summit these peaks if you're so interested. Something completely different from all the snow and ice that you've seen is this picture where I went through the jungle for a week to get to the top of Carstensz Pyramid. And Carstensz is the highest peak in the oceanic chain of islands, which include Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand. And you go through several temperate zones. You stay on this glacial lake at just under 15,000 feet. And then this is the summit of Carstensz Pyramid. This is the wasteland or the barren, sterile environment of Antarctica. Probably one of the loneliest places that I was at, because on some of these other peaks, there'd be many, many other teams. But at this time when we were there, we were a group of 5 climbers, well, 4 climbers and a guide. And we had another team with about 6 climbers and a guide. And we basically had that entire part of the continent to ourselves. So it was very isolated. And we got stuck in a large storm for about 36 hours that tore up our tent and delayed our summit bid. But we learned a lot, and we hunkered down and made the best of it. And it's amazing what kind of stories you can tell when it sounds like a freight train is running through your tent. I did get lucky enough to stand on the summit of Vincent and carry a flag for one of my organizations that I support, the American Dental Association. A lot of people ask me how you go about doing your business when you're in some of these inhospitable climates. There is no plumbing. This is as close as you get to plumbing, is a bucket with a makeshift toilet seat on it and some snow brick walls for privacy. So that's about the extent of it. And you just do that away from other people, and you hope that the walls don't fall down. I was lucky enough to practice for Everest by going to the Himalaya in late 2018 and climbing the world's 6th highest peak called Choi Yu. Choi Yu sits at 27,000 feet. It has several camps to get you to the summit. This is actually Camp 1 above base camp. And it is at an elevation of about 20,000 feet or just under. And before you get to that, you're on the left side and you're coming up all of that rock and crushed stone. And this is the first part, or the first point, that you're actually on snow and ice. So what brings me a little bit to our conversation today is this was me on the summit of Choi Yu. And what's interesting is what's actually behind my right shoulder there. So this picture shows me elated. I had oxygen to climb that day to the summit. I took off the oxygen for this photograph. And then on my way down, I'm with my guide, my Sherpa guide, and I asked him, you know, how I had done, because of course I need a lot of self-validation. I'm just that insecure. And so he said, "You did very good." And I said, "Well, good. You know, I want to climb Everest, and I wanted to know what's it like? You know, can I do Everest?" And he stops and he looks at me and he says, "Yes, you could do Everest." And I said, "Is it hard?" And you know, this is coming down from Choi Yu. And he said, "Yes, very hard." And I thought to myself, well, this was very hard. And if he doesn't think that, then what does that mean for me and for climbing Everest? So behind my right shoulder, that's Everest. And so that was the peak that I was going to climb the following spring, which is this time now last year. And I looked at that and I said, oh my God, how does somebody climb that? That looks really, really hard. And if you can follow some of my, if you could see the mouse out here that outlines this, and we'll talk about it later, is the area from the balcony up to the southeast ridge. And this is the southeast ridge to the south summit, and then all the way over to the north summit. And you'll see some more pictures later as we zoom in. And it's amazing that you actually travel and walk this spine. So in late March of 2019, I set out for the Himalaya again and arrived in Kathmandu, met my team, and then flew to Lukla, which is the last area that you can get to before you have to walk to get anywhere. And then from there, we started to work our way up the Khumbu Valley. This is the town of Namche Bazaar, which is one of the largest towns in the valley. And you could see the way this town is sort of terraced along the hillside. This is the town of Fortse, which several of our Sherpa are from. And you can see the ground there this time of year is potato planting season. I've been in touch with my Sherpa because they closed Everest for climbing this year. So all of these local Sherpa guides and porters are not working because there is no work for them. And they're busy just doing things in their village that they would normally have delayed until late June, when they would return to their villages after a climbing season. Here I am again working my way up the Khumbu Valley. And this is a monument that's just out of the town of Ferice to Scott Fisher, who was one of the climbers lost in that tragic year of 1996 that was popularized in the book Into Thin Air. In that year of climbing, there were several deaths because a bad storm had come in and had caught people by surprise. And Scott Fisher was one of those people who lost his life. In this area, this monument and others to other fallen climbers was put up for visitors to see on their way to Everest Base Camp, both trekkers and climbers. They don't have any kind of monuments at Everest Base Camp because no one's allowed to stay there unless you have a climbing permit. So even the visitors that are trekkers can go to Everest Base Camp, but they're not allowed to stay there. They have to leave that same day and stay down valley, usually in one of the towns a few hours down. So on the way up, we made it past an area called Lobuche. Lobuche is a 20,000 foot peak, so it's a little higher than Kilimanjaro. And it's a good practice peak to do a little shakedown for your guide and for your other team members and the Sherpa to see how well you handle yourself in this type of environment. And so there I am with Lobuche in the background. And that's what it looked like the morning we left to climb, and arrived on the summit and came back down. And I was feeling pretty good at that time. I was healthy and strong and made a good showing and impressed everybody around me, including myself, only later to get sick and to suffer and not be as successful. But that's the joys of climbing. You know, whenever you have a bad day and you're talking to your friends and you're discussing the good and the bad of how things are going, when it's bad, they just say, hey, listen, there's always tomorrow. And so if you didn't accomplish your goal, if something you fell short on, in most cases, there was always going to be a tomorrow. One of the most exciting things for me in my entire climbing career was leaving Lobuche and then heading up through the town of Gorbachop and then on to Everest Base Camp. And so this is a look from the trail down at Everest Base Camp, my first time looking at it. And from all the things that I had read and from everything that I knew, I guess this wasn't really what I expected to see. You know, it's not a city. It's not like driving into Philadelphia. It's not a town for those that are skiers. It's not like Park City or Breckenridge or Vail or anything like that. It's just a bunch of tents strewn along the moraine, the crushed rock that the ice leaves behind as it melts. And so you can actually see that these tents are on top of rock, and all of that rock is actually on top of ice. So that's your home for 2 months while you're preparing and working your way up the mountain to train and to prepare to go to the summit. If you don't carry the gear on your back, you might be lucky enough to have a porter who's bringing it in, and they do. They'll carry in duffel bags. And whatever they don't carry is going to be put on the back of yaks. And so here's a slide of the Yak Train coming in that day. And there would be many, many coming in at the beginning of the season and many, many leaving at the end of the season. And keep in mind, just like friends and family and people that you know right now that are not working, these people are not working either. They depend on tourism, and there is nothing going on there right now. They are all in lockdown. So that's me at base camp, and I know part of my conversation today was to discuss how you occupy yourself while you're in base camp. And there are lots of things to do because there is a lot of downtime. It's not like every morning I was up before sunrise and I was climbing for 8 or 10 hours and moving myself forward every day. There would be many days where I would be back at base camp and I'd be in my tent reading or sorting through photographs and posting some through an internet connection. that we would get at base camp. And I would be able to try to communicate with loved ones, and then maybe we'd do some other crazy things. So maybe these are things that you did while you've been home the last 6 weeks or so. We made our own little movie, which I don't have to show you, but suffice to say that we took a gamble and made a silly movie with everybody as actors. We tried to do calisthenics to stay in shape, and I got to tell you, trying to do push-ups or core exercises at 18,000 feet is an interesting challenge, but we managed to do it. It's nothing like picking up rocks and putting them down again, because they're just like grabbing weights at the gym or in your basement. A little primer on how you get to the summit from base camp. So base camp sits at the bottom of the Khumbu Icefall, and that's the dangerous part that you hear about that moves around every day and changes. So there's ladders that take you up and over big chunks of ice and across large crevasses. So the idea is that there's a group of Sherpa whose job every day is just to make sure that that path is open. It's about a 6-hour climb to get from base camp through the icefall and up to Camp 1. And from Camp 1, it's a trek through what's called the Western Koon. The Western Koon is a big, flat, gentle rise up to Camp 2. The Nuptse peak, which is an 8,000 meter peak, is on the right. Lhotse is facing you, and you can see the Lhotse face. And Everest is on your left side. And you're walking up this valley in order to get to what eventually is Camp 4 to make your bid to the summit. Here's a photograph that kind of shows that a little more in detail. So what we had to do to train was first climb Lobuche, and then after our Lobuche climb, we came back and we rested at base camp. And then we went up, and in one day we went up to Camp 1, and we turned around and we came back. So that was 6-7 hours up to Camp 1 and about 3 hours back. So that was a long day, 9 hours of climbing. And then when we returned, we were able to rest for 3-4 days. And then we turned around and we went back up to Camp 1. And we spent a couple of days at Camp 1. And then we worked a little way up the Western Koon, not all the way to Camp 2, but we went an hour or two out and came back, spent the night, and then came back down to base camp and rested for another couple of days. And then about 5 days later, we left and we went to Camp 2, and we spent a few days there, and then we came back down to base camp. And then we had some bad winds that held us up for maybe 8 or 9 days before we came back up to Camp 2, and then went up to Camp 3. And when we were at Camp 3, we had some bad weather again come in, and we descended back down to Camp 2. We didn't stay at Camp 3, and then back down to base camp. Now that was about this time last year when I checked my entries and my diary. I was on my way to Camp 2 today, and I will be there for the next 3 or 4 days. This is where I actually got the most ill that I was on the trip. Not only did I manage to get an upper respiratory infection, but I actually came back down with pink eye. And so you want to talk about quarantine. I think I'm one of the first people that ever had to be quarantined for pink eye that anyone knows about in the Everest Valley. No one had ever been aware of that before, and just thank goodness the medical tent facility had cream or had drops for that were 5 years expired because nobody ever uses it. And luckily they worked, and the infection went away in about 3 days. But I had to live in my tent. I wasn't able to eat with the others. I had food brought to me, like room service in a hotel, and I couldn't go out and do laundry or touch anything or do anything, a lot like what everybody's going through right now. I had my fellow climbers come around and sit in the dirt outside my tent, and we would talk or listen to music or something like that. But I wasn't able to interact other than that for 3 days. And I got to tell you, that was hard. Just like all of you are missing your friends and the social nature that we all have. It's hard to isolate yourself and not engage with other people. And I only had to do that for 3 days. I didn't have to do that for the 6 weeks like we've all had to do since we've been shut down here. But anyway, I made it back down and recovered, and then I was able to join the fun with everybody else. Again, a little closer look at what base camp looks like. Nothing sexy. Again, there's no permanent structures there. All this disappears when the season ends. There'd be great times in the morning. You'd go into your tent in the evening after dinner. It would get too cold. It would get well below 0 when the sun went down. So you'd have dinner. The tents that you would eat at that are common tents are not heated. So you would get very cold very quickly. You'd be wearing your big puffy down suit to dinner. And then you'd want to go back and climb in your sleeping bag and try to read or listen to music or again, review your pictures, write in your diary or whatever it is that you did. And you had your own personal tent at base camp, so you were alone. So from 7 in the evening until the sun came up over the face of Nuptse in the morning when it would shine over and warm up the area, we wouldn't come out of tents. And so it wasn't until about 7:30, 8 o'clock you'd come out for breakfast when the sun would hit. And so for 12 hours, you'd be alone. You would read. Maybe if you did have a friend come over and you'd play cards or something like that, but it was hard to do because it was just cold. You just wanted to be all zipped up and you didn't want to have your hands out and doing stuff if you didn't have to. There were 40 different teams on Everest this year. Some teams had 30 to 40 climbers, plus all the Sherpa and the support. And some teams would only have 2 or 3 climbers. So you could have a team area where you could have 20 tents. You could have a team area where you would have 2 or 3 tents. The larger tents were generally group tents. The sort of outhouse looking tents were either shower tents or toilet tents. I talked about the Khumbu Icefall, and I've got some great pictures of what that looks like and the ladders that you have to go up and over. So, you look at that and you say, that's not a big deal. I've had those on the side of my house to, clean out the gutters. But now put that out outside your house tomorrow and put on a pair of 3-pound boots that have crampons or spikes on the bottom of them. And then throw on maybe a 30 to 35-pound backpack and then put on a helmet and carry an ice axe and some other gear and try to start climbing that and go up it and try to come down it. It becomes quite an interesting exercise. So here's a little picture of a team going up, trying to climb through this little path and then up the ladder at the far end there. Another look at trying to get up and over this chunk of ice. And now remember, everything's two-way. So if you go up it, you're going to have to come back down it. And sometimes you'll come back down and you'll say, gee, this doesn't look like it did when I came up. And that's because something changed. A big chunk of ice fell, a ladder broke, and now you've got a different way to come down. And sometimes you're coming down by ladder, and sometimes you're rappelling down by rope. The problem with rappelling down by rope is the ropes sometimes freeze if they're not used regularly and they're out of the sun. And so when they freeze, they become very slick, and that means there's not a lot of friction. And when there's not a lot of friction, you can slide down very, very quickly. So sometimes you had to wait for the sun to hit the ropes or you could rappel down. The beauty of the Icefall is really second to none. And for those of you that like to do activities with music, you either run with music or you work out with music or you study with music, the best part about this is to just turn everything off and to just walk and listen. I mean, it's scary in some parts because you hear a lot of ice breaking and falling, and you just hope it's not coming down on you. But at the same time, it's some of the most beautiful scenery that you can ever absorb, and it's best done in silence. And so very often, nobody's talking. Everybody's just enjoying scenery around them. And it's very technical. It looks there like it's not that steep, But I got to tell you, your heart's probably beating at 150 beats per minute, maybe a little bit more, partly because you have to have a faster heart rate in order to pump enough oxygen around your body during these times. So your heart rate's pounding away, and you're drawing in a lot of air, you're taking a lot of breaths, even though the terrain doesn't look particularly difficult. It is. This is Camp 1. Again, it's not fancy, it's not a resort, there's no swimming pool, there's no lake. You're in a tent. Now you're sharing 2 to a tent because it's a little more inhospitable and there aren't that much resources, so you don't have a tent for everybody up there. That's a view from the other direction. And now you're looking at part of the base or the foothill of Everest there, but that's not the summit of Everest in any way, shape, or form. This is looking up the Western Koon. You're at Camp 1, and you can see the broken ice as it buckles up there, and that all has to be climbed to get onto the path to Camp 2. Straight ahead is the Lhotse face. On your right side is Nuptse, and on your left side is Everest. So a lot of days when you were climbing, this is what it would be like getting around those big chunks of ice. And you could be leaving at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning, long before the sun comes up, because the sun's going to start to warm up stuff. And when stuff warms up, it breaks off and falls. So you really don't want to be in the sun if you can avoid it. So a lot of climbing is done at night and early in the morning, and then you're done before the sun hits. One of the interesting things about the thermal heating of the sun and the reflection of the sun is that you could be in a tent when in the morning there's no sunlight on it, or nighttime, and it could be 20 below inside the tent. And when the sun hits it, it can get to be 80 degrees in the tent. It just heats up like a terrarium, and you have to strip down almost to your underwear in order to be comfortable. But yet, if you went outside, you'd need to put on a down jacket. So there was a lot of pleasure in feeling warm when you could, and you took advantage of those afternoons if you could get into a tent and you didn't have to be somewhere. I said that there were ladders. There are ladders that are both vertical and horizontal, and sometimes they're not straight. So this one's on a tilt, and that just adds to the fun with the spikes on your shoes and all the gear going around. And all you have are 2 ropes that are not very tight, and you've got to hold those and walk across. It's pretty scary. This is the actual Lhotse face. It's a sheer piece of ice. There's not even really any snow on it. And in the early part of the season, when you climb it for the first time, it really is kind of flat. Once it's been worked up a little bit by the climbers that will go up and down it a couple of times, you'll build some sort of steps into it that can make it a little bit easier on your last trip up it to the summit and back. That's just another view. And another view of my group taking a little training hike out that day to the base of that. We did do that in the daylight. It's a little safer there. We're in the middle of that valley, and so we're staying away from the potential of avalanches on either side. This is what it looks like to go up the Lhotse face, and now you can get kind of a sense of the steepness of it. And you can also get a sense of possibly the temperature. I mean, there I am wearing a down suit and doing vertical climbing. So, you know, you do get warm. It's something that you are, you know, working, your body is working. And the fact that you're still that cold, going and working that hard tells you how cold it really is there. So I told you about downtime and what you do, and because we're coming up upon that time of year this weekend, when I got back down to base camp, I knew it was Mother's Day. So I took this out and I took an opportunity to write a little note to my mother and then capture that image and post it on Facebook. And then I was able to FaceTime with my mother a day or so later. And in talking with her, she said, "Oh, thank you very much." She said, "Where'd you find a piece of ice to write that on?" And I said, "Mom, that was toilet paper." And she responded to me. She said, "Well, that's a perfectly good waste of toilet paper. Didn't you need it up there?" I said, no, we had more. So after recovering on my last rotation, we finally took our opportunity to go for the summit, but we had to wait for the weather to open up. I talked to you about the bad weather in 1996. At that time, weather forecasting was not as good, and many climbers were lost due to bad choices made. But the weather modeling is now so much better that when it's not good, we don't go to the summit, or we don't go on to Camp 2s or 3 for rotation. They get such good intel now that we're really a lot safer, and we're traveling in better weather than we ever used to. So we were hunkered down at base camp for about probably 10 days, and it wasn't until the 17th of May that we got the nod to leave to go to the summit. And so that would involve leaving after having done a climb of Lobuche, a climb to Camp 1, a night over at Camp 1, a couple of nights over at Camp 2, another trip up to Camp 2, and climbing up to Camp 3 and back. We finally now were going on our last rotation, which was going to take us all the way to the summit. So we set off for Camp 1 and spent the night, went to Camp 2, spent the night and the next day, and left very early in the following day for Camp 3. And at Camp 3, we pulled in and went on oxygen, most of us for the first time. Because I had not been feeling well, I had unfortunately developed a respiratory infection that I had trouble shaking. And for the first time in my life, I thought I might not make it to the summit. And for me, I'd made it to the 6 other summits. I never had missed a summit opportunity. And here I was now faced with the mental anguish of thinking about not getting there. My team leaders suggested that I leave Camp 2 with oxygen this time instead of waiting till I got to Camp 3. And the reason that they explained for that was that I would probably travel easier to Camp 3 and then be more rested as we moved on to get to Camp 4 and then to the summit. On the rotation prior, where I wasn't feeling well, it took me 8 hours to climb as high as I could from Camp 2 to Camp 3. And as weather was coming in, we were told to turn around. And where most of my teammates had gotten to Camp 3 and had turned around, I never had gotten there. I was still an hour short. And that was with 8 hours climbing. And I still had 2 to 3 hours of climbing down to get back to Camp 2. And so I was very dejected. I took them up on the offer. And now at Camp 2, I got up at 5 in the morning and I put an 18-pound oxygen tank in my backpack. I was not the only one. There were others of us that had similar issues. And so we were about half of us on bottled oxygen. And I set off now for Camp 3 again for the second time. This is 10 days later. And all I could think about was how poorly I had performed the time before. And while I was there, and I'm hiking up in the morning, and I'm passing a few people here and there, and I'm feeling really good, and I'm with my guide, and my guide is telling me that things are going well. I didn't really have a chance to look much at the time. I just knew that it was still dark and it wasn't really getting light, and I was already going up the steep part of the Lhotse face to Camp 3. And I pulled into Camp 3 and I looked at my watch, and it had been just under 4 hours that it had taken me to get there. So with oxygen, I actually traveled and feeling a little bit better. I traveled at twice the speed or the pace that I had traveled 10 days earlier. And I pulled into Camp 3, and I was the first person of my team into that camp. It was just me and my guide, my Sherpa guide. And I got in there and I just started to cry. And I remember that, and I'm not ashamed to tell people that, because it was one of the happiest moments for me, knowing that I was possibly now on my way to the summit. Because had I not performed, I would have been really upset, and I would have seriously thought about whether it was safe for me to continue. It was 3 hours later, in most cases, for my entire team to get up there, and I was already resting, eating, and drinking, and had a very restful night. Got up the next morning, continued on oxygen at that point, hiked now another 6 hours, hiked, climb, up and over the rest of the Lhotse face, the yellow band of rock and ice, and all the way to Camp 4, which is a very gnarly place. This is going over the Geneva Spur. So this is the yellow band. So you transition from ice to rock. Again, another challenge with the footwear that you have. You can see how steep it really is. And it's quite difficult, and you're breathing very hard. And then this is the last pitch to get over to Camp 4, and it's called the Gibraltar Spur. Once you get up top of that, you can look down and you can see the entire Western Koon, and now you have Nuptse on your left, and you have Everest on your right, and then behind you is Lhotse. And that's the entire valley that you had climbed up from Camp 1 to Camp 2, and then Camp 2 to Camp 3, and Camp 3 to where you are now. And then this is looking up at the remainder of Everest. That's the triangle face, as they call it. And that's what you have to climb from Camp 4 to get to the summit. And that's what we would do later that day. So I got up at 5 in the morning. I arrived at Camp 4 at about 11 in the morning. And I would now be at Camp 4 till about 7 in the evening, when I would get ready and I would work my way to the summit. And this is a little taste of what Camp 4 looks like. A bunch of tattered tents from decades ago that got left behind, tin cans, human waste. It's not a very pretty place, and it's not very comfortable. The air is very thin. You're living on bottled oxygen, and you know, you're very lucky to be alive. This is what they call the death zone. So at 7:30 that night, I would put on my backpack and a fresh tank of oxygen. Check all of my emergency medicines, that they're in the right pockets. My food, my water are all in the right place. And my guide and I would set out. We weren't really climbing much as a team. I mean, we were together, but it would be each climber and Sherpa to go at their own pace. But we did kind of hang together, but we didn't need to. And we would climb now from 7:30 at night for about 4.5 hours to reach the balcony, which is the arrow that's indicated on the bottom right of this picture. And we would rest there in the dark and swap out oxygen tanks before we would take the long trip up the southeast ridge all the way up to the south summit. And then from the south summit, we would, or I would be able to change oxygen out again to another fresh tank that would take me all the way up to the summit, and then basically back down to the balcony again. So I took the advantage of having extra oxygen so that I would not run into a problem where other people were scared as they had to wait on the descent with the crowd that formed and possibly not get back in time. And they were panicking that they'd get pulmonary or cerebral edema. I didn't have to worry. I prepared very well, and I had everything lined up. As the Boy Scout that I am, I had everything ready, so that I felt very safe the whole time I was there. Here's a daytime picture of what the triangle face looks like. Again, it was 14 hours, 10 hours to get to the summit, and it was another 4 hours back down to Camp 4. So my journey started for the summit really without much sleep from 5 in the morning the day before when I left Camp 3. Went all the way through the day, didn't really sleep at Camp 4, left at 7 at night, 10 hours up to the summit, 4 hours back. I took a 2-hour nap, was shaken vigorously to wake up by my Sherpa guide. We loaded up our gear and we down climbed back to Camp 2 where I could get off bottled oxygen, and arrived back down there after about a combined 30 hours of climbing with maybe a 2-hour rest. That's me and Pega, my Sherpa guide, who I've been in touch with. Again, I was supposed to be there this time right now with my son Henry. We were going to trek to base camp as a graduation for him, but unfortunately we didn't make it. So we're going to try to do that again at a later time. Just a little bit of crowd information. That's my picture of what the Hillary Step and the summit, the final summit push looked like. You might remember from the news, this is just what the lines look like that you have to click into. You might remember the crowd from the news on how crowded it really was climbing that day and the day before. Luckily, when I was there, we were there so early, you can now see the comparison. The news that hit shows the line on the left, which was not me. That all happened hours later. We left so early in the evening before that we summited right at dawn, and were lucky enough to start descending and get through a lot of that traffic. So we were very, very lucky to not have to get entangled in that and then have to, be telling people how horrible it was and how we had to wait for hours. This is again a look as you're coming down the Triangle Face at Camp 4 and what you have there at the base. And that is the new tents, old tents, and everything else. Just a beautiful part of the world. Again, something that you really have to take in. It's hard to see it in a picture. Being there is really something else. And then after a recovery of a day at Camp 2, we worked our way back down base camp and then returned our way back home. Again, just the mountain has so many hidden beauties to it that it is just it's just something not to miss. And this was coming back down in the morning, getting back through the Western Koon and back to Camp 1, and then returning back down through the Icefall. This is the very top of the Icefall. And then this is navigating our way back down through the Icefall. And then back to base camp. So all of that took place in the month of April and May last year. I was lucky enough to make it back home here on May the 29th to a hero's welcome by my family, and happy to be able to have completed the 7 summits around the world. I don't have any plans for any adventures forward right now. I am looking at all hobbies and all interests, and I'm up for any suggestions that any of you might have for me. But most importantly, I want you all to know that these are goals that you can set for yourself, and you could say maybe one day you could be doing this. If you would have asked me when I was 12, 13, or 14 years old that I would be climbing Everest one day or any of these summits, I would have laughed. I was just a normal kid. I wasn't particularly athletic. I had trouble on hikes like some people I know do. And I would never, ever have imagined I would be this person being able to talk to others and share this experience of I guess, endurance and motivation and mind over matter. Just like the period of time that we're going through right now, there is so much that is uncertain as far as moving forward. And if you think about it like a climb to a summit where you can't predict the weather and you can't predict the mechanical failures, you can't predict your health, but all you can do is just take things one day at a time. And I think that's how you have to look at it right now, because there will be sunny days tomorrow and the day after. And things that we were doing, we will be doing again. And so I tell all of you that now's the time to dream and dream big, and then find out what it is that you need to do to make that dream come true. So with that, I want to thank my family, especially for giving me the path that I needed to do this climbing for the last 15 years. That's my wife, Susan, my daughter, Caroline, and my son, Henry, and my mother. I got to thank my mother too. But also all of my fans and friends through Troop 181 that were in contact with me, and through the Cradle of Liberty, and my work staff that allowed me to leave for 2 months. I have a lot of support from a lot of people, and it showed me especially how much people care, and the worry that they put into it was something that I was also surprised with, and it just showed me how much love and care people have for others. And that's the other message right now, is that as bad as things are for us having to stay home, I think that there are people that are suffering far, far more than we are. So with that, Cindy, I am done, and I'm happy to entertain some questions if there are some.
We've got a couple of questions for you here in the chat. So the first one was, did you go through the Nepal side or the Tibet side?
So that's a great question. The climb of Everest last year was on the Nepal side, which is the south side of the Himalayan range. And that's the most popular place to climb from. When you climb from Tibet, you're actually in China, and it's harder to get a permit, and it's harder to climb from the north. So more often than not, more people that have summited Everest have summited from the south side rather than from the north. When I went to Choi Yu in October of 2018, that's a mountain that you climb from the Tibet side, and you do climb that from the north. So I climbed from the north when I climbed Choi Yu, but I climbed from the south from Nepal when I climbed Everest.
And Bruce, you're a little bit muffled. I'm not sure if there's something different with your audio going on. While you take a look, someone very much so, Rick, very much so enjoyed your cold weather session at University of Scouting a few years ago. And Pat Brown would like to know, what peak was your favorite hike?
Well, can you hear me better now? How does that sound?
Yes, it does sound better. Thank you.
Good. Hands down, Everest is just iconic. I can't get past the beauty and the history and all the things that go along with Everest. So it is by itself very, very special. But Carstensz Pyramid in Papua, Indonesia is just crazy weird. You're going through jungle. You're having to navigate different tribal regions where you get stopped and you get held hostage, and you have to barter your way out. And so it's kind of weird and crazy and not like anything else that I'd ever done. But it wasn't unsafe. It was just different. And the landscape and going through all the different temperate zones were very, very interesting. But I would say, you know, for just effect, Everest is the king. There is no one else.
So what is done with the used oxygen canisters?
Well, you know, in past years, there was a lot of litter, and above Camp 2, a lot of oxygen canisters were left behind, as well as a lot of other materials and things like that that were too difficult to bring down. That all ended in the past 5 or 6 years, where they made real attempts, both the Nepalese government and all the climbing teams, to come back down with the gear that they take up. So basically a leave no trace philosophy. They've been practicing that pretty well. So unfortunately, it is somebody's job to carry the oxygen up to Camp 2, and then we're all carrying our own individual tanks. But the Sherpa will take it to Camp 2, and then the Sherpa will take some of those tanks up to Camp 4, where we'll, or Camp 3 and Camp 4. So we'll have those extra tanks up there. We don't have to carry 3 and 4 tanks at a time. And then they're all going to be brought down by Sherpa on return trips. They do have a helicopter that'll come to Camp 2, but it gets very expensive. Sherpa labor is cheap, and so a lot of times the Sherpa can add 2 or 3 empty oxygen canisters and bring those down the mountain, as opposed to having to load them into a helicopter. But there is still a lot of trash that is trying to be removed little by little every year in order to get the stuff off the mountain that was left from years ago.
So another question is, did you incur any long-term effects from your Everest experience?
I hope not, unless my speech was slurred tonight or I said things that I didn't intend to. I don't think that I have any mental capacity issues. I didn't suffer any frostbite, thank goodness. I don't have any effects from the cold weather. On Denali, I did get some minor frostbite, and that taught me a very valuable lesson in how to protect myself for future climbs. So that was a great climbing opportunity for me that I used for all of my future climbs to protect myself. You can never really protect yourself well enough, and that involves having duplicates of everything and kind of thinking through things before you do them. We're talking about environments that are so hostile that if you take off your glove in a strong wind just to do something that requires fine motor control, take a photograph or open a can or a Ziploc bag or something like that, you can literally get frostbite in the time it takes you to do those things. So you need to be thinking about, how are you going to get to that food that you have? How are you going to take that picture? What is your gear? What is your backup gear? And you need to start really behaving in an ultra conservative way, similar to kind of what you have to do now, which is protect your face from possibly other people around you. But it's all of that management that is part of the Boy Scout code. Be prepared.
So I'll put this question together with the next one. First, do you believe in the Yeti? And second, what kind of food did you have to eat to prepare for your trip? Was it particular fat contents or higher calories? And during that final climbing stages, what did you eat to keep your energy up?
Okay, all really good questions. We'll start with the Yeti first. The only thing that I have that's Yeti-like is the Yeti mug. There was no Yeti sightings while I was on the mountain. Do I believe that a Yeti exists? Well, like anything else, I can't deny or undeny. So if it's there, it's there. I don't have any proof one way or the other. So I'm a dreamer and a hoper. So I'd like to think that there is something out there, and maybe one day it'll show itself, but not while I was there, not last year anyway. As far as diet, I can tell you that in my training leading up to leave for Everest, and while I was there, most of us as climbers and training to climb, we do a lot of endurance work. And so that could be, being out on my bicycle for 100 miles or 75 miles. It could be running 10 miles. It could be hiking for 8 hours. One of my favorite things to do would have been to go to Mount Misery and Mount Joy, which many of you know what I'm talking about, in Valley Forge Park. And I would spend better part of 6-7 hours there. I would do 17 miles crisscrossing, looping back and forth over both of those little peaks. I could get 5,000 vertical feet in 17 miles in about 6.5 hours. And so during that time, I would have maybe my wife join me for an hour and a half, my son join me for an hour and a half, a friend or two join me to just sort of break up the monotony, and I would eat. And the training regimen would be to try to have something every hour. One of the great things when you do such endurance activity is that there's nothing that's off limits. So you want to come home and have a milkshake and a hamburger, or you want to go to Shake Shack and have double everything. That's when to do it, because you're burning calories like there's no tomorrow. You can't keep on the weight while you're training. When I got to Everest, I noticed that most of us were all kind of paleo eaters. So we all wanted the fat. We all wanted the protein. And we were more focused on the fat and the protein than we were on the carbs. But again, you still eat a lot of junk. You eat a lot of candy. You eat a lot of everything. Sadly, when you climb on summit day, there's not a lot of opportunity to stop and eat. You can try to squeeze a couple of goos into your mouth, or cliff shots or something like that. And again, it's hard to gain access. You're wearing these large padded mitts that look like lobster claws, and you have to take them off if you're getting to something. So eating and drinking, which you should be doing every hour for those 14 hours, you don't do as much. So where I should have been eating 500, 1,000 calories an hour, I probably did 10 hours of climbing to the summit, and I probably consumed less than 500 calories. So I lost 14 pounds when I returned, and I would suspect I probably lost 10 of those 14 on the summit day.
Wow. Well, Bruce, you have such an amazing story to tell, and we're just so thankful that you spent your time this evening sharing it with us. I'm going to share the screen here. Just one moment. Here we go. Can everyone see the screen here?
Yes.
Okay. So if you like what you heard tonight, for all of our class Eagle Scouts in the class of 2019, our Eagle Scout recognition dinner has been moved to Sunday, November 8th, and our guest speaker is Dr. Bruce Terry. So we hope to see many of you there as mentors at the Eagle VIP reception, or if you're a class of 2019 Eagle Scout, we cannot wait to celebrate you. We have a lot of different online programs going on throughout the council. I especially wanted to make sure you were invited to the virtual camporee going on a week from Friday. And we also have different career mentor panels going on. Everything can be found on our website at colbsa.org/virtual. And I just wanted to give everybody a reminder that programs like this and our other virtual programs are brought to you by our supporters of the Cradle of Liberty Council. We have just launched an 11-day giving campaign called Secure the Adventure, and we hope that you will consider supporting with a gift if you haven't already. And thank you for helping us spread the word. Bruce, thank you again for being with us tonight. Is there anything you'd like to share with everybody as we close out our program for the evening?
You know, I want to thank everybody for taking their time to participate tonight. I'm hoping everybody got something out of it through you or to me directly for those that know how to get a hold of me. I'm always happy to talk. I have no shortage of opportunity for conversation. So we could pick up a conversation in any way, shape, or form you might want. Again, I want to thank my family for all of their patience and allowing me to do something that in some cases they felt was an unsafe hobby. I want to thank my buddies all at Troop 181 for supporting me also during this time, my staff and all of my people associated in the dental world, but most of all the Cradle of Liberty. I am very passionate about organized scouting. I feel as if it's a great resource for young men and women, and I hope more young men and women take advantage of it in the future, even if it has to, at least for a temporary period of time, be modified in order to be safe. But scouting is such an important part of my life and has always been. I can't say enough about it.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great evening.